They said reform was coming. Then another detainee died inside a city jail that had already promised change. The announcement triggered outrage, investigations, and renewed demands to shut it down entirely. Across the country, a different prison was being praised for rehabilitation, even as critics questioned whether transformation was real or simply rebranding. Few people outside the walls understood what was actually changing. And long before either debate, an island fortress once declared escape-proof became a symbol of federal power and public fear. This closure solved one problem, but raised another that still echoes. A city press conference unfolds as officials confirm another in-custody death at Rikers Island, cameras flashing while reporters demand answers about oversight failures. Families of detainees gather outside the jail complex, holding photos and calling for transparency regarding conditions inside the facility. Correction officers line up for shift change before sunrise, discussing staffing shortages and overtime demands that have become routine. Inside a housing unit, detainees wait for movement that is delayed due to limited available staff to escort them safely. A federal monitor reviews compliance reports, highlighting missed benchmarks tied to previous court-ordered reforms. City council members question Department of Correction leadership during a public hearing streamed live to New Yorkers. Public defenders describe clients experiencing repeated lockdowns that restrict access to medical appointments and court appearances. Medical staff navigate security protocols while attempting to respond to urgent health concerns within tight supervision limits. A union representative addresses media, emphasizing rising assaults on staff and calling for increased recruitment. Advocacy groups release a report citing patterns of excessive force complaints documented over multiple years. Administrators review internal data dashboards tracking incidents, staffing levels, and housing unit stability. Construction plans for borough-based jails are presented in architectural renderings promising smaller, modernized facilities. Community members in proposed borough locations debate whether new jails will improve safety or shift problems elsewhere. Detainees attend limited educational programming sessions interrupted by operational lockdowns. A court session is postponed after transportation delays prevent timely detainee transfer from Rikers. City officials reiterate their commitment to closing the island facility within a publicly stated timeline. Investigative journalists analyze inspection reports detailing inconsistent supervision practices. Correction supervisors attempt to redistribute available officers to cover high-risk housing units. Families report canceled visitation appointments due to security staffing constraints. Policy analysts examine how bail reform laws influence the jail population and facility capacity. Mental health professionals discuss challenges providing consistent treatment in unstable housing conditions. A federal courtroom reviews progress under an existing consent decree addressing use of force reforms. Officers undergo mandatory training sessions aimed at de-escalation and crisis intervention techniques. A detainee advocacy hotline receives complaints about extended confinement and restricted movement. City budget meetings debate funding allocations for jail operations and long-term replacement construction. Former detainees share experiences during a public forum focused on systemic reform. Oversight officials conduct unannounced inspections to evaluate housing conditions firsthand. Construction crews begin preliminary work on one borough-based facility, signaling slow movement toward transition. Analysts question whether infrastructure change alone can correct deeply rooted management issues. As night falls over the East River, Rikers Island remains active, operating under scrutiny while its future closure hangs unresolved. As policymakers debated closure timelines in New York, detainees at Rikers Island continued navigating daily uncertainty shaped by staffing gaps, court delays, and fluctuating housing assignments. Internal reports described units operating below recommended supervision levels, forcing administrators to consolidate housing areas and reassign personnel across facilities with limited advance notice. These adjustments sometimes resulted in extended lockdowns, restricting movement for meals, recreation, and educational programming, while leadership attempted to stabilize operations. Families reported canceled visits and delayed communication, reinforcing public frustration over transparency and accountability within the city's jail management structure. City officials maintained that borough-based replacement facilities would provide smaller populations, improved design, and better access to courts and family networks. But critics questioned whether new buildings alone could resolve entrenched cultural and managerial challenges documented over decades of oversight findings. The Federal Monitor continued issuing compliance updates, noting incremental improvements in some areas while identifying persistent failures in supervision and incident reporting. What remained unclear was whether systemic change could occur before the planned closure deadline arrived. On the West Coast, San Quentin Rehabilitation Center advanced renovations intended to modernize classrooms, vocational workshops, and communal spaces supporting reentry preparation. State leaders emphasized that physical redesign must align with programming goals, creating environments structured for learning rather than solely containment. Some incarcerated participants completed college degrees, marking milestones rarely associated with maximum security institutions in previous decades. Still, measurable reductions in recidivism would require long-term tracking beyond initial program enrollment numbers. Budget analysts warned that sustained investment would determine whether reform survives political shifts and economic downturns. Meanwhile, Alcatraz's legacy continued shaping public perception of what incarceration represents in American history. Today, the former penitentiary operates as a National Park Service site, drawing visitors who explore preserved cell houses and administrative corridors. Interpretive materials present documented histories of discipline policies, daily routines, and the logistical challenges of operating an island prison. The contrast between Alcatraz's historical closure for cost reasons and modern debates over reform funding remains striking. Financial considerations have repeatedly influenced correctional policy, often as decisively as safety statistics or public opinion. Back in New York, projections of detainee populations fluctuated with changes in arrest patterns and judicial processing times. These variables complicated planning models for replacement facilities, forcing recalculations of capacity and staffing requirements. Advocacy organizations argued that reducing pretrial detention through policy reform would ease pressure on infrastructure altogether. Opponents cautioned that abrupt policy shifts risk unintended consequences if community support systems are not equally strengthened. The national conversation increasingly acknowledged that incarceration policy intersects with housing, healthcare, employment, and education systems. At San Quentin, reentry coordinators worked to connect participants with post-release services, recognizing that institutional progress must extend beyond prison gates. Yet long-term evaluation remains ongoing, with researchers studying outcomes over years rather than months. Rikers Island continues operating while construction progresses, placing current detainees at the center of unresolved policy debates. Alcatraz stands silent, its empty cells serving as reminders that institutions once considered permanent can, in fact, close. Whether modern facilities follow similar paths depends on political will, administrative capacity, and public engagement. The future of incarceration in America remains unsettled, shaped by decisions unfolding inside courtrooms, legislative chambers, and prison corridors alike. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries. Policy debates eventually circle back to the people inside the facilities, where reform is experienced not as legislation, but as daily routine shaped by staffing levels and institutional culture. At Rikers Island, federal oversight continues monitoring compliance with court-ordered mandates addressing excessive force, supervision failures, and delayed medical responses. City officials maintain that closure remains the long-term objective, yet operational responsibility persists until new borough facilities become fully functional. Correction officers navigate overlapping expectations, balancing enforcement duties with de-escalation policies introduced through updated training requirements. Detainees awaiting trial confront uncertainty, particularly when court backlogs extend detention beyond what many anticipated at arraignment. Public defender organizations argue that reducing unnecessary pretrial detention would ease pressure on infrastructure and improve safety outcomes. Opponents counter that judicial discretion and public safety considerations must remain central to detention decisions. Meanwhile, San Quentin Rehabilitation Center advances its reentry-focused model under close observation from policymakers and researchers nationwide. Expanded college access, vocational training, and restorative justice initiatives continue operating within secure housing structures designed decades earlier. Administrators emphasize data collection, understanding that long-term credibility depends on measurable outcomes rather than symbolic language. Early indicators show increased program participation, but analysts caution that durable impact requires sustained funding across political cycles. Staff culture remains a determining factor, as reform depends on consistent application rather than isolated pilot programs. Community partnerships provide post-release pathways, linking incarcerated individuals with employers willing to consider rehabilitation credentials. Victims' rights advocates continue participating in legislative discussions, ensuring accountability remains part of the evolving correctional framework. Across these debates, the legacy of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary persists as a historical reference point for federal incarceration philosophy. Its closure demonstrated that even institutions considered permanent can be dissolved when costs and priorities shift. Unlike Alcatraz, however, modern facilities operate within far more complex legal and social landscapes shaped by civil rights litigation. Federal courts today play an active role in monitoring conditions, particularly when constitutional standards are challenged. At Rikers Island, compliance reviews often hinge on documentation accuracy and supervisory consistency. At San Quentin, evaluation focuses on whether rehabilitative investment reduces future incarceration rates. Both models reveal that incarceration policy is rarely static, evolving in response to litigation, research, and public scrutiny. Budget allocations remain central, influencing staffing recruitment, infrastructure modernization, and program sustainability. Political leadership changes can accelerate or slow reform trajectories, depending on priorities and fiscal conditions. For families of those incarcerated, the debate is not abstract but deeply personal, shaped by visitation access and communication stability. For correction officers, daily safety concerns remain immediate, regardless of broader policy ambitions. For legislators, balancing accountability, rehabilitation, and public safety requires navigating competing constituencies. Observers note that no single facility defines American incarceration, yet certain institutions become symbols of broader systemic tension. Rikers Island symbolizes crisis and transition within urban detention policy. San Quentin represents experimentation with rehabilitation within a long-standing correctional structure. Alcatraz stands as a reminder that even the most secure prison can close, leaving behind questions about what incarceration should ultimately accomplish. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries. Long after headlines fade, reform debates continue inside administrative offices where performance metrics, compliance audits, and staffing projections quietly shape the next phase of incarceration policy. At Rikers Island, transition planning teams coordinate with architects and city agencies to prepare borough facilities intended to replace the aging island complex. Yet timelines remain vulnerable to construction delays, procurement disputes, and shifting political leadership that can redefine priorities with each election cycle. Correction officials must simultaneously stabilize present conditions while preparing for a future system not yet fully built. That dual responsibility strains management capacity, particularly when incident reports trigger renewed federal scrutiny. Independent monitors continue evaluating supervision ratios, response times, and documentation accuracy to determine whether constitutional standards are being upheld. Each compliance review influences court decisions that can mandate additional oversight or operational restructuring. For detainees, however, reform is measured in daily realities such as access to recreation, reliable medical appointments, and timely court appearances. When those services function consistently, tensions tend to decrease, according to multiple oversight findings. When disruptions persist, instability can quickly return, reinforcing skepticism about promised improvements. On the West Coast, San Quentin's transformation remains an ongoing experiment observed by correctional systems nationwide. Educational enrollment numbers continue to rise, supported by partnerships with accredited institutions and nonprofit organizations. Graduation ceremonies held inside secure facilities symbolize milestones rarely associated with maximum security incarceration. Still, Researchers emphasize that long-term recidivism data will determine whether symbolic progress translates into systemic change. Funding stability remains central to that evaluation, particularly during periods of economic uncertainty. State lawmakers weigh competing demands for public spending, balancing correctional reform with broader social service priorities. Advocates argue that investment in rehabilitation ultimately reduces long-term incarceration costs and community harm. Critics respond that measurable public safety outcomes must justify continued allocation of taxpayer resources. These debates echo historical questions raised decades earlier when Alcatraz ceased operations due to mounting maintenance expenses. Its closure illustrated how financial sustainability can override even the most entrenched institutional identity. Modern facilities, however, operate within expanded legal frameworks shaped by civil rights litigation and public transparency expectations. Digital reporting systems now track incidents, staffing patterns, and program participation with far greater visibility than previous eras allowed. That transparency creates new accountability but also exposes systemic weaknesses more quickly. At Rikers, proposed borough facilities are designed with smaller housing units intended to improve supervision and reduce large-scale unrest. Design alone, experts caution, cannot replace consistent leadership and organizational culture reform. At San Quentin, administrators stress that rehabilitation requires engagement from both staff and incarcerated participants. Training initiatives aim to align custody responsibilities with educational access and structured programming schedules. Observers recognize that cultural transformation often unfolds gradually rather than through immediate, visible breakthroughs. Across these institutions, the central tension remains unresolved: how to balance safety, accountability, and opportunity within constrained budgets and political realities. The future of American incarceration will depend not only on buildings or policies, but on whether sustained commitment outlasts the urgency of crisis-driven reform.